Recently, I read an article that threw me off a little bit because I found myself thinking Mike DeWine, governor of Ohio, might actually be doing something out of the goodness of his heart. Then I recalled that this is the same guy who did not request federal aid initially from the Norfolk Southern crash and then turned around and blamed Joe Biden for not providing it, even though Joe Biden is incapable of providing that federal aid until it is requested. So, I did a little digging. Let me, first up, introduce you to what it is we're talking about, because Mike DeWine wants to ban anything in Ohio for teaching children how to read other than something called the science of reading, which we will find is not very scientific. Ohio could soon join the rush of other states requiring schools to use the science of reading in all its classrooms by 2024, going even further than many states by banning other literacy approaches that have lost credibility. One quick note on that phrase, because, oh boy, it sure makes me nervous. When a news article says lost credibility, that can mean one of two things. That can mean that the professional community no longer considers it credible, or it can mean that it is no longer popular. There's a huge difference between those two things. For example, I give you the anti-vax movement. That is an example where people could say vaccines have lost credibility until you realize that you're just talking about a group of brainwashed individuals. Let's have a look at what this is actually talking about. Currently, the state law allows districts to teach reading however they want. Under his proposed bill, Governor Mike DeWine would force them to pick only phonics-based science of reading materials from a list the Ohio Department of Education will create. DeWine has also asked the state legislature to ban the use of any 3-cueing materials or lessons, an approach considered the foundation of popular teaching methods known as whole language, balanced literacy, or, particularly in Ohio, reading recovery. Only a few states have gone as far as DeWine proposes, including Arkansas and Louisiana, which have already banned schools from using any methods based on 3-cueing. My question that is cropping up, folks, is not whether or not science of reading is helpful to students. It's what do they have against 3-cueing? What do they have against other methods of teaching? It's unclear, other than these appear to be an excuse to blame bad results on. But let's keep reading. But officials in 8 other states are joining Ohio in seeking similar bans. According to Tom Green, National Legislative Director for Exaligned in Action, the education advocacy group created by former Florida Republican Governor Jeb Bush. Scott DeMauro, president of the Ohio Education Association, one of 2 teachers' unions in the state, has already said educators shouldn't be limited in how they teach reading. First I've heard in this article from someone who actually works in the profession is in direct contrast to what Governor DeWine is suggesting. DeMauro said last week, before the full scope of DeWine's plan was made public, that all teachers use phonics as part of their lessons, but they are just one piece of a larger puzzle when it comes to teaching reading, and that a one-size-fits-all solution was not a good move. As far as saying approach X versus approach Y as a prescribed reading plan, we don't think it's appropriate, DeMauro said. We had a lot of questions and not a lot of answers. Fortunately, I spoke with Dr. Paul Thomas. He's a professional educator and he runs the website Radical Scholarship. He broke down for us exactly what's going on with science of reading.
I'm Paul Thomas. I'm a professor of education at Furman University, and that's in Greenville, South Carolina.
Now, I understand you have a background in education where you actually worked in schools. Is that correct?
Yeah, first 18 years of my career, I was a high school English teacher, and I've been in higher ed now for 21 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
So then you will have seen every level of what I really wanted to talk about today. In your words, what is science of reading?
Well, that's really more complicated than you would think. What I generally tell people is there's basically three versions that are happening right now. There's sort of a science of reading movement that is primarily driven by the media. And a lot of my work is addressing how that one is the problem. The movement and the narrative that's being told in the media is extremely misleading. Another level of this is marketing. Science of reading has become a way to brand educational material to sell. So the movement and the marketing are kind of working together. And a lot of the momentum that the movement is getting is because marketing is using the media to clear market space, because a lot of the science of reading movement is attacking popular reading programs and reading materials. So if we get in states like Arkansas and a few others have banned some of the popular programs, so that opens market space. So you've got the movement, which is media based. You've got marketing, which is labeling materials science of reading, and there's no real mechanism for monitoring how valid those labels are. But if you just go to Education Week, ads will pop up and it'll be, reading programs and reading materials, and they're all science of reading. And then the third is what we would rightfully call just the research base on reading. And of course, there is a science of reading. It's about a century old. It's extremely complex. It's very deep. We've had scientific research on reading for decades and decades and decades. And that is obviously important to teaching, but it's pretty much muted by the first two elements.
That's an interesting point. Proponents of science of reading, the fanatics, say that it's based on settled science. In fact, I think Governor DeWine in Ohio recently alluded to this. But in your work, you seem to disagree with that assessment, that it is not. You say that it's not based on settled science. Why is that?
Well, yeah, DeWine is falling into a pattern that you see. It's happened with Youngkin in Virginia, and what I see as very problematic is the media is giving a really false message that's very compelling. Like, the narrative is very compelling. So politicians are kind of jumping on that because parents have kind of fallen under the spell of that really compelling narrative. And the two things that I've identified in the media is they say that the science of reading is simple and settled. And both of those are kind of, again, they're very compelling. People like simple stories, but they're both untrue. Pick up any major literacy journal, and you will see that what we really have in the field of reading is a debate, and that's a good thing. It's a robust debate. Are there some things that a lot of literacy scholars agree on? Well, of course, but there's a lot of things that literacy scholars genuinely and for valid reasons disagree about. And that's how science, I think, fundamentally in the United States, people misunderstand science. And I think if you see the recent COVID pandemic, you see how complicated science is, because at the beginning we were all wiping things down. Yeah. And it's because we weren't quite sure how it was transmitted. And the wiping things down may have been less scientifically credible in the long run than masking. But people are still very, skeptical of masking. So science of reading is just as complicated as that. It's in development. It's something we're debating.
I still have station issued wipes from that era. I got a stack of them. You're quite right. I mean, we tend to want to oversimplify things, and then the first thing we hear that sounds like a plan, we stick to that even if the information changes.
Right, exactly.
Let's go to the other side of that. In your opinion, what is the harm of adopting a science of reading only based curriculum? What are we losing out on when we do that?
So I'd say there's a couple of layers here. First, we've been making pretty much the same mistake for decades by adopting reading programs. Our schools have always adopted a reading program, and then a lot of the effort is training teachers to do the program and then holding the teacher accountable for doing the program.
Mm.
Well, if you notice by the way I'm saying that, we're not paying attention to, are they teaching children? So being program based in a school is fundamentally a mistake. So the argument right now in the media primarily is programs X, Y, and Z have failed our children, but programs A, B, and C will solve the problem. Well, no, they won't. The problem is adopting programs. So that's at one kind of big level. That's a mistake that we're moving from program to program. At another level, what's being proposed, what's being supported by the science of reading is called structured literacy. And those are primarily scripted programs. So teachers are told exactly what to say so that every teacher teaching third grade is doing the same thing at the same time. And then students are expected to have the same exact responses and outcomes.
Hmm.
I think it's pretty easy for people to realize how problematic that is. In my work, I'm really focusing on two things: teacher autonomy and addressing individual needs of students. I bet if you did the math, I've been teaching 39 years. You cannot predict what your students need. You have to be a professional and identify their strengths, their needs, and then you address each student as an individual. Now, often you get clusters of students with similar things, so that's why you do small group work. So most teachers know that you do whole class instruction, small class instruction, and individualized instruction. Well, structured literacy is only whole class instruction. It is, it's telling the teacher exactly what to say. A program cannot know what a third grade class in Mississippi needs. A program cannot know that compared to a third grade class in North Dakota. Those are not the same children. It's not the same needs. So I think that we're kind of missing the boat here because we need the better teaching conditions and we need teachers given the opportunity to do what they know how to do.
What would you have instead of programs? Like if you had, for example, how do you have a government body ensuring that there's a certain quality of education going to students? In what way do you formalize that so that you know that quality is there, if not through these specific programs?
To me, I still think we're going in the wrong direction. I think we have to start at the school level. I've proposed in my policy brief that schools should sit down with their teachers and say, what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, and what do we need? So every school, every district, every state kind of starts at the school level and then builds out these needs. And then if you're going to spend taxpayers' money, you should be buying materials that support identified needs as opposed to buying materials that do a template on top of everybody, regardless of their strengths and their weaknesses.
Okay, so this would be like giving more of a general budget to schools to be spent. Let's say a state wanted to improve its schools' reading levels. It would be giving a general budget to schools to be spent how they choose on reading programs.
Right, and you certainly could set up a mechanism. I would say I'm not a big fan of accountability because it becomes kind of senseless. It becomes kind of a checklist. I'm more a fan of transparency. So if the state said, every third grade or every elementary school gets XYZ reading budget, well, you should have to identify, we did the work. Here's what we identified we're doing well. Here's what we identified we're struggling with. And then here are the materials we need with some justification. Like you just can't randomly or willy-nilly buy your materials. You would have to say, here's our specific needs. We've identified these materials that would address that. And then, of course, transparency would include follow-up. What's happening as a result of this. So, and again, a lot of what's I think is problematic is we're very intense about outcomes. We're obsessed with third grade. I do think we have to be more patient and move away from these, these drop dead points. We have many states have adopted third grade retention, which is incredibly harmful. So you have
Yeah.
children retained based on one test score. Of course, if a third grader is not at the level we would like, it should be addressed, but it certainly shouldn't be addressed by by punishing them.
And then next year, when you have a third grade class that seems to do fantastic, it doesn't really take into account the held back third graders who actually had 2 years of third grade.
Right. Retention distorts test data. You're removing the students who are likely to score lowest, and then you're reintroducing them when they're biologically a year older. So states that use retention, such as Mississippi, it's not that their test data isn't accurate, it's that it's distorted. And if you try to compare Mississippi's test data on third and fourth graders with a state that doesn't use retention, then you're genuinely not comparing similar populations, even if you account for things like race and poverty.
Let's look at the other side. I see a lot of science of reading advocates saying how much they can't stand three queuing. What is that? And do you agree with their assessment that three queuing, for example, is one of those techniques that is not good for teaching kids?
A fundamental problem with the movement, the media-based movement, and sort of it overlaps with a parental based movement is I call this a Rush Limbaugh technique, which is not a good thing, by the way. Limbaugh was very good at misidentifying something and then attacking his mischaracterization. So if you don't pause to look at their definition, so there's a narrative in the science of reading movement that's kind of misrepresenting three queuing as guessing, and also as sort of this lazy effort by teachers to have students only look at pictures when they're reading. I would say all of that's caricature. Sure, are there probably some reading teachers that are doing a couple of things wrong? Well, every field has some people who do some things wrong. But in general, we're not teaching kids in America simply by guessing. That it's over exaggerated, it's misrepresented, and in the scholarship you'll more likely see like multiple queuing systems, and helping students, especially in a world that is less text-based than it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Having a student understand that reading is more than text is certainly not only not harmful, it's probably a good decision. So just as an example, you may have a student, an elementary student, and they're trying to read a text, and the sentence, the word says pony, and there's a picture of a pony, and the kid reads and gets to pony and doesn't know the word, looks up and sees the picture and goes horse. Well, some people would say in the moment, if the kid is fluent and reading and it's got a flow to it, that you leave that for a moment, and it's not an urgent thing, that it's not the exact right thing, because essentially the child comprehended. I don't know anybody that would leave that entirely. You would come back and say, okay, this word starts with what letter? And the kid would go P, and you'll go, well, does horse start with P? And then you have them interrogate using those other strategies. I think one of the mistakes of the science of reading is it overemphasizes text and letter sound connections. Nobody's saying that doesn't matter. There's nobody who is anti-phonics. That just doesn't exist. But reading is way more complicated than simply matching letters to sound and words to sound and meaning. And so a multi-queuing system helps students early on recognize that there's more to reading than just text. So to go back to your original question, certainly it's not harmful, but the way it's being presented in the science of reading movement is a misrepresentation. It's kind of a cartoon version of what really happens.
To me, this sounds like a group of people who are, let's say, health advocates, and they're all talking about getting your cholesterol down. And they're saying all the science backs the fact that your cholesterol must be down. And we're wasting money paying for doctors that deal with cancer and liver disease. and we should only be putting money into the heart attack doctors. And it's to me, it sounds like nobody's saying that we shouldn't have doctors that specialize in heart attacks, but we shouldn't do that at the expense of these other things. Is that a good
Right.
summary?
It's over. Yeah, I think it's oversimplification.
Hmm.
And again, to go back to our very first question, the reason it's not the reading science isn't settled is because we all agree that phonics, phonemic awareness, and decoding are important, essential for readers. We don't agree how to get there.
I see.
So the science of reading is arguing that every student needs a full systematic phonics set of instruction before they comprehend. People, and I'm
Ah.
on this side, say that they need some phonics instruction up front. Then as you become a reader, you develop and gain those phonics, the phonemic awareness, the decoding strategies through reading. And that's where there is no settled science on that.
Hmm.
That is a genuine scholarly debate with reasonable people on both sides.
How does poverty factor into this debate then?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. A lot of these education reform movements, and I've been in these fights for quite a long time now. I would say there tends to be two camps. There's the camp that argues schools can do nothing about poverty, so we have to just focus on school reform. And then there's the other camp that says schools alone will not overcome external poverty influences on children. So we have to do both. We have to have school reform, but we have to have social reform. And that's where I come from.
Hmm.
I think a really good example, since 2013, 32 states have adopted science of reading legislation. Since that time, NAEP data for fourth grade has been flat, but during the COVID era, it dropped dramatically. Well, what that tells me is no legislation on reading will overcome huge systemic forces. So the COVID impact on NAEP is something schools could have never overcome. And I'm not blaming schools. The drop in the scores were perfectly reasonable things. Anybody would have known that was going to happen. To me, COVID is no different than systemic poverty. So I've said this many times. If a third grader is not learning to read because the child is hungry most days, or is sick and has no access to medical care, or doesn't know where they're going to sleep that night, to be perfectly frank, that kid is making the right decision. Those life forces are more important than learning to read. Our problem as a country is no child should be in that position to have to make that decision. And I get concerned that too many times we'll say, oh, if we just have the right reading program, all these poor kids will learn to read. Well, that's nonsense. That's putting all the pressure on the teachers and the children and not addressing these systemic forces.
As you mentioned, and corrected me in an earlier email, science of reading laws have been passed in 32 states. Earlier, I had said 29, and that was from an article I think from last year that I had seen that. So the
Yeah,
rate of,
Education Week says 32, but I think anywhere around there is probably reasonable. Yeah,
well, the idea that this has quietly crept up on over half of American states
exactly.
is crazy. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, so it, but you did mention it started with Mississippi in 2013. Um, what I notice is early adoption seems to have been mostly conservative leaning states, although California did join in 2021. Is there a reason this legislation seems to have appealed to conservatives or conservative legislators?
Well, oddly, and this is a piece I'm working on right now. The the anti-CRT movement, the book banning, and the science of reading movement all have strong kind of Venn diagram overlaps.
Hmm.
You would not think so, but ideologically, these are all relatively conservative movements, and they're conservative traditional views of schooling. At the core of the science of reading movement is phonics. Historically, phonics has been a sort of touch point for conservatives who criticize education. It's 1940s. People in the draft, very low literacy.
Hmm.
Eleanor Roosevelt, came out and said, we're failing our kids. They don't know how to read. And of course, the response by society in the 1940s was lack of phonics. And it's repeated. 50s, you had Johnny Can't Read. 60s and 70s, you had people attacking whole language. In the 90s, you have people attacking balanced literacy. Every time it's that we're teaching reading without enough phonics. And that's a recurring, like I said, it's a touchstone for conservative views of education, which is very analytic. You think you have to build things from their parts to their whole, and literacy is holistic. And that's, again, if we go back to, that's why it's not settled. Many of us, struggle with breaking something like reading or writing into parts because it's a holistic behavior.
I see. So if I could summarize what you're saying here, it sounds like this tends to appeal to conservative voters because it's kind of it's an easy answer for what's wrong. Is
It's a
that it?
traditional view of, yeah, it's a traditional kind of parts to whole analytic view. And historically, that's, conservatives want more structure to education than probably humans actually respond to well. And it's also feeds into our efficiency model. In the early 1900s, we made a very clear decision in the United States. We did not choose John Dewey. John Dewey's view of education was more hands-on, more holistic. That's extremely expensive. And we did choose kids sitting in rows doing multiple choice tests that can be scored by a machine. So the irony is that phonics is very easy to create lessons for. It keeps children calm, and it's very easy to test. And you can test phonics in a much simpler, quicker way than you can test things like comprehension, which is very messy.
Okay, so I was ready to give my first ever "it's not about the money," but no, right at the end there, it looks like it swooped in because when you're testing with the machine, when you're doing it that way, it's much cheaper, isn't it?
Right. And we really bought in, by the 1920s, we really bought into mass production education. And some of us, I'm a workshop kind of teacher. I'm very individualistic. My students sit in my classrooms and work, and I walk around and help them. They send me work and I give them written feedback. I don't really like to stand up and just yammer at students, especially when I was teaching high school. So some of us are kind of, the holistic workshop type of educators. And again, you need smaller class sizes. It takes longer. It's way more complicated. Assessments are way more complicated to actually prove that anything is happening. So yes, I'd say some of the phonics movement is traditional in the sense that it fits into our economic ideology, where we want to be efficient and do things quickly in a mass way.
What is we touched on this a little bit earlier, but let's hit it again now because it seems to be one of the major selling points of this. Mississippi had, after adopting science of reading in 2013, it had an improvement for fourth graders in the National Assessment of Progress, the NEAP test. Was that genuinely due to science of reading? And if not entirely, what do you think caused it? Follow up, because we already more or less talked about this. I just want to really underline it. What is the third grade gate?
So yeah, this is a really good way to understand the science of reading movement. So 2018, Emily Hanford wrote an article called "Hard Words," and that kind of set the ball rolling. And that's kind of the real ground zero of the science of reading movement. But in 2019, she got to write an article for the New York Times, and it was on Mississippi was the only state that had fourth grade reading improvement in 2019.
Hmm.
So that piece in the New York Times is a really good example of kind of saying two things at once that don't match. So Hanford actually says in there, wow, look at this great improvement. We don't know why it happened. And then a couple paragraphs later, the implication is science of reading. So I will tell you right now, there is no scientific research explaining why Mississippi scores went up. There is nobody's done any research. All of this is anecdote. All of this is political promotion because Mississippi goes all over the country and testifies about their great improvement in its politics. It makes the politicians look like they've done something, but the irony is the science of reading people don't use science to prove their claims. Now, let me add something really important.
Sure.
Since 1992, Mississippi has gradually been improving fourth grade reading scores consistently since 1992, decades before the science of reading. Before the 2013 legislation, they had a huge jump in fourth grade scores that had nothing to do with that legislation. It's a very similar jump they had after the legislation. There's been dozens of different programs, standards, teacher practices since 1992 in Mississippi. There is no singular cause for the improvement. There is no singular cause for any failures in schools. And this is, again, it's just messaging. It's just a narrative. It sounds good, but the Mississippi score going up is absolutely real. And I think Mississippi should be praised. They have been improving for decades. All throughout the 90s, the aughts, and the teens, Mississippi has been improving. The problem is we don't do the kind of really deep, complicated research to understand why these things happen. One, because it's incredibly expensive and it's very hard to find cause in education like that. NAEP is a random sampling also. It's not every student in any state. So it's not the kind of data that really lends itself well to understanding how something happens. I will say we have to layer onto this. Mississippi is an extreme grade retention state. The recent data, they retain about 1,000 Black students a year, about 1,000 Black students a year. That's criminal in my opinion. Grade retention is strongly correlated with dropping out of school. It's very harmful to children. It's punishing children for things that aren't their fault. Kids who score poorly on tests are generally poor. They generally are behind for things they have no control over. Grade retention is a punishment. It is not an instructional approach to the problem.
It's embarrassing, too.
It is, yes.
Nobody wants to be a 19-year-old senior.
Exactly.
Governor DeWine is seeking $129 million from the legislature looking at the future of this. To retrain teachers and replace elementary school textbooks with science of reading materials. This is in part because of the Mississippi results, which, as you've brought up, we can't attribute that to science of reading necessarily. Is this money well spent? And if not, how would it be better spent, this $129 million?
No, this is a terrible use of money. It's a political and a marketing, I call them boondoggles. It's just a scam. And we've done it 100 times. Governors figured out a long time ago that education is political points. The shift happened in the 80s and 90s where governors, George W. Bush used his education platform to get in the White House. His Texas Miracle, which was proven to be false, became No Child Left Behind. So this is a standard pattern that we do in education. And the other irony here is states are adopting a program called LETRS, LETRS, which has no scientific evidence behind it that it is effective. So we're saying that teachers need to be retrained to teach the science of reading, but we're not even using a scientific program to retrain the teachers. We also have no evidence that is scientific that teachers need retraining. The problem is not teacher training. The problem in most states is third grade teachers have 35 students in their class. And of course, we could spend that money on reducing class size, but that's not as sexy. There's not many governors that will go out there and stand behind something that actually will work because it's not going to get them votes.
Fair enough. So instead of saying we need to hire more teachers, here's 129 million, go hire more teachers, they say we're going to overhaul this thing.
Right.
All right. Oh, I worry. Is there big money behind science of reading? For example, and I say this having looked and been unable to find it. For example, are textbook printers lobbying for this? Is anybody lobbying for this other than a grassroots movement?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Again, if you Lexia and Letters, if you go to their pages, they have Emily Hanford's articles up in the corner. There's a close relationship, and I don't think there's money changing hands. This is not some kind of conspiracy theory. This is just the way the market works in the United States. Media is saying things that serve the market indirectly, sometimes directly, and the market uses that. Two of the four dominant reading programs are being attacked directly. There have been articles in the New York Times attacking units of study. So there's a media leveraging here of getting programs out of schools, and there are science of reading programs lined up to move in. So there's definitely money behind the movement.
What I'm hearing is that the villain, as always, is Milton Friedman. Do you see any parallels? In fact, you mentioned it, you alluded to it earlier, but if I could have you go into a little more detail, do you see any parallels between the Reading First grant program that was part of No Child Left Behind and this current push for science of reading?
Yeah, that's a really good question because it's the exact same pattern. So No Child Left Behind used a political group called the National Reading Panel. That was formed under Clinton. And then No Child Left Behind codified that into federal law. And No Child Left Behind required that teachers only use scientifically based materials. This happened in 2001. And there was a Reading First scandal because when you put in for federal money, if you simply put Open Court, the program, the publisher, Macmillan, in the report, in the request, you would get approved. There were states that weren't approved, and they would just change the program and they would get approved. And there's a scandal. You can look it up. I mean, this was pay for play, and it was a bad thing. We just did that 20 years ago. The Reading First scandal was just 20 years ago. And the saying that everything has to be scientific, we just did that.
It does sound to me like it's the same group of people making the same decision over and over with different names associated with that decision. Is that more or less accurate?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of money to be made in education reform. And we've been doing reform since the 80s. This is a Reagan. It started with Reagan, and we've been in a constant state of education reform ever since. And we're still unhappy. What makes me upset is we haven't figured out yet. Reform is not the answer at the base that we're doing it. We're doing in-school reform only. That has never worked. My home state, we've probably had 7 different sets of standards since I've been a teacher. We're never happy. We're told this set of standards will save us. A few years later, we need a new set of standards.
Well, it sounds to me, again, since the 80s, since the dawn of Reaganomics, I mean, there does seem to be a connection between like just runaway neoliberalism and this focus on churning out a profit from schools somehow. Everybody's got their fingers in that pie.
Right.
Wild. Well, where can people see more of your work if, like me, they've become fascinated with what you do?
I'm on Twitter. It's PL Thomas EDD, and I've got a blog and I put a lot of material there for free because I really believe people should have access to the material. And it's radicalscholarship.com. But if you just, I think if you Google my name and put blog, I think you'll find it. Again, there's a lot of material there that's designed for parents, educators, and political leaders, because I think one problem that we have is, there's a lack of information.